Hello, my name is Mary Roffers. I am a Polish-American anthropologist from Urban Anthropology Incorporated, the organization that brings you these programs. Right now I'm standing in front of what might be the most beautiful church in the United States, the Basilica of St. Josaphat in Milwaukee. The Basilica is located in the largest Polish neighborhood in southeastern Wisconsin, Milwaukee's Old South Side, and many Poles still live here. My grandmother used to wash the steps in front of the basilica every week. Let us glimpse some of the beautiful architecture and artwork inside. This grand church was built at the turn of the 20th century, and it was actually built out of the remains of an old post office in Chicago. When the post office was torn down, this parish shipped all the materials on 500 flat cars to Milwaukee. What is amazing about this fabulous basilica is that it was built stone by stone by the hands of the Polish people in this neighborhood. Let's walk 2 buildings down the street. Here is the old South Side Settlement Museum that celebrates the lives of the Poles and other groups in this neighborhood. I am now sitting inside the 1929 dining room of the Roska family that still lives in this neighborhood and owns this house. Many of you have toured or will be touring this museum, but let's move back in time. You might wonder what life was like for the Poles before they came to America. Like most countries before they industrialized, the population tended to be farmers. The farmers in Poland were very, very skilled, and the country was known for its wheat. People, of course, make bread from wheat, and bread was always a staple food for Europeans. Now, the farmers were so good in Poland that Poland was called the breadbasket of Europe. But most of the farmers in Poland were poor peasants who were just barely able to eke out a living because they did not own their land. They had to rent land from princes and other nobles. Almost all of the people in Poland were Catholics, and the Catholic Church has always been very important to the Poles. The peasants lived in small villages. In these villages, many of the peasants made crafts to decorate their cottages or to add beauty to celebrations like weddings. One of their crafts was artwork made out of paper cutouts. The people living in the villages would cut little shapes from colored paper and put these together to make beautiful pictures. This is very fun, by the way. Perhaps at one time you've done this in your arts and crafts classes. Another craft the Poles were really good at was wood carving. They often made ornate little boxes, and they stored important things inside of these, such as pieces of jewelry. I am sure you all know something about the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a period when many European countries were learning new things and revisiting old learning, and making advances in culture such as in writing and art and music. The Renaissance took over Poland in the 1500s. Polish art, literature, and music really flourished, and it was at this time that an important Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus made an important discovery. He was the first scientist to propose that the Earth revolves around the sun. You might know that before Copernicus, people thought the Earth never moved and that the planets and stars revolved around the Earth. Earlier you saw a map of Poland and the countries of Russia, Austria, and Germany. You might wonder why this is important. Remember that I said that Poland was the breadbasket of Europe? Many of Poland's neighbors wanted a piece of Poland for that reason and other reasons. There was a very long time when these 3 countries fought battles over Poland, and because together they were much stronger than Poland, they started taking over parts of the country. Then by 1795, Poland actually disappeared. In fact, it disappeared for over 100 years. Look at this map. The yellow part of Poland was taken over by Germany, or Prussia. The gray part was taken over by Austria, and the red part was taken over by Russia. During the years when Poland had disappeared as a nation, a very famous musician came out of Poland. His name was Frederick Chopin. He was as important a musician in Europe as a musician like Elvis Presley or Ray Charles or J-Lo, has been in the United States. Chopin traveled the world and wrote many musical pieces for the piano that mourned his homeland, the country that disappeared. There were times when the Polish people could still lead relatively normal lives in their cities and villages, even though they were conquered. But at other times, their conquerors forced changes on them. A terrible time for the Polish people came when the Emperor of Prussia, Bismarck, made a law that only German could be spoken in that area of Poland that Prussia had taken over. The emperor confiscated much of the land that had belonged to the Poles and gave it to Germans. He also made it hard for the Poles to practice their Catholic faith. Then just a few years after this, the prices of grain started to drop dramatically. Many Poles found themselves near starvation. The persecution of the Polish people by their conquerors and the drop in grain prices gave the Poles reasons to come to the United States. In this program, we learn about several other cultural groups that were forced to come to the United States and other areas to avoid starving. We also learn about groups that had to leave their homelands because other countries had taken over their communities and the ways these groups faced persecution. You probably know something about World War II and the Holocaust. You probably know that millions of Jews were forced into concentration camps by Germans and killed. You might not know that a large number of the Polish people who were still living in Poland at that time were also killed in those concentration camps during World War II. This also led to a lot of Polish people coming to America. It wasn't easy either for the Poles when many came to the United States. By the time large numbers of Poles were coming to America, there wasn't much good farmland left. So many had to live in cities and go to work difficult and dirty jobs in places like tanneries and foundries. They settled all over southeastern Wisconsin, as well as other areas in the state and nation. In Milwaukee, the largest concentration of Poles settled on the Old South Side, the area we are in right now. Other Polish areas in Milwaukee were along the Milwaukee River, around Brady Street, and the River West neighborhood, which you saw on the map. Yet another area was on Jones Island, where the Polish Kashubs built a little fishing village. Ask your anthropologist about that charming area. Wherever they settled, the areas were called Polonias, which means Polish communities. The Poles always formed these cozy neighborhoods where they took care of their own people. They were very self-sufficient, and mom and pop stores were everywhere. They often lived with extended families, and you typically would see grandparents in the households. The Polish Americans in these cozy neighborhoods would build their own churches and organize their own insurance companies and grocery stores and restaurants and funeral homes and newspapers. This area once had the largest Polish language newspaper outside of Poland. This was called the Kurier Polski. But you might wonder how these tightly knit Polonias reacted when other cultural groups began to move in. It is time to return to your anthropologist and get some ideas from you. Hello again. You have been wondering what kind of people would have made good neighbors for the Poles. Well, the people from this Old South Side neighborhood will tell you now in their own words. Let's hear it from them.
Historically, the area's two largest ethnic groups have been Poles and Latinos of Mexican descent. The Poles were the first to settle on the Old South Side. They were joined by Latinos in the 1970s. Although they represented different cultures separated by language, as well as time of arrival, the two groups brought many common cultural traits and experiences to the neighborhood. Poles and Latinos both faced language barriers they had to overcome. The Polish and Mexican immigrants were overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and both brought in mystical and healing practices.
This parish, of course, was founded by Polish people in 1883, and now more and more the neighborhood is changing, and more Hispanics are coming to the church. And not only in Milwaukee, but in major metropolitan areas throughout the United States, Hispanics choose to live alongside Eastern European groups for some reason or other. Perhaps there is a psychological attraction because both groups are primarily Roman Catholic.
In the neighborhood, there was always a little old lady someplace that sometimes it all depends who was talking about her. Either she was a witch or she was a good doctor, you know. But always a midwife. When there was a baby in the family and being born in the neighborhood, this woman would be a midwife. She'd help deliver the babies. And if you got a sprain or a dislocation or something like that, you'd go to see her and she'd pull your thumb and put your thumb back into place. And she always had some kind of old country remedy or soup or herb or some kind of a drink that was supposed to cure you.
When I was small, my grandmother lived with us, my mother's mother, and she had her own ideas of how to treat us when we'd get sick. So when we were tiny babies, if we had stomach upsets, she would give us chamomile tea. In Polish, that's called rumianek. And you'd make a weak tea and dilute it with the water and give it to the baby in a bottle to settle their stomach. And my dad, if his stomach was upset or he was in different things, we always had oil of wintergreen, green drops that we took, and boiled up flaxseed, and different herbs like javanna, which was also kind of good for upset stomachs and stuff like that.
During their earliest years in the neighborhood, most Poles and Latinos relied on extended family networks for economic support. Both groups also maintained similar early patterns in gender roles.
When young people got married and couldn't afford to get a place of their own like they do now, an apartment or a house or a condo, they would move in with older relatives. I know my grandparents, when they got married, which would have been in the 1920s, they moved in with an elderly aunt and uncle who had no children, and they just rented 2 rooms from them and helped with the housework and the yard work and all the cooking, and sort of had a combined household until they could afford to save up enough money to go out on their own. In turn, when this aunt and uncle became elderly and couldn't manage, it was their turn to take them in and take care of them.
Even though the ethnic groups have changed, one thing that they do have in common is that the way they live, they're more family-oriented, and somehow they can have 1 or 2 generations. The grandmas play the role of the babysitters, and the uncles and the cousins participate in the care of the children. The ethnic groups are different, but it seems like the social ties and the method of organizing or socializing is the same.
Poles and Mexican Americans on the South Side tended to enjoy similar leisure time activities, which nearly always centered around religion, ethnic foods, and the neighborhood's Kosciuszko Park. Recreational activities for both groups were multi-generational.
Our entertainment really revolved around the family, and most frequently on weekends we would wind up at one or the other grandmother's house. And she was a magician because she would take 1 chicken and she'd be able to feed as many as 20, 30, 40 people, because all the cousins and uncles and aunts and everyone came to Grandma's house for Sunday dinner, and then of course playing games and cards and just enjoying associating with one another.
And of course, each one had their festivals, and the street festivals brought together a whole lot of people. And I noticed in all the dances and street festivals that the Polish as well as the Mexican Americans took their whole families with them, their children, and you see the parents and the brothers and sisters dancing with the little kids. So it was a family event, which was very nice and very similar. Of course, the music was very lively. The instruments might have been different, but the music was also similar as far as polkas and waltzes and dances like that.
Most early arriving Poles and Latinos in the neighborhood came from rural backgrounds and had limited skills for urban employment. This often left both groups struggling economically for a time and facing prejudice from other Milwaukee populations.
Polish people began to come to the United States in large numbers after the Civil War. They came with very little. They didn't speak the English language. Many of them were very poorly educated, and they didn't have very many economic resources to help them establish themselves in this country.
The Wisconsin area was primarily populated by the German population, and there was a lot of animosity, and Poles had a hard time getting jobs. It was blocked by German people who, it was almost like the old saying, Irish need not apply, no Irish need to apply, or Chinese did not need to work in the West. It was that same mentality, and so when Poles would come here, they would, out of desperation, try to hide their ethnicity. Case in point, my own great-grandfather, whose name was Jan Paradowski, came here, couldn't get a job. He finally got a job with the railroad, but he changed his name to John Parker and worked very hard to hide his accent or mellow his accent, so no one was really sure what country he was from.
We came up here from Texas, and we were going to Sturgeon Bay and areas up north to do cherry picking and things like this, all different kinds of fruits and vegetables. But one thing I remember is there were so many different cousins and brothers and sisters. We were all jammed into, there'd be like 3 or 4 families jammed into one house, you know. But we did what we could just to get by.
A lot of the Hispanics worked in foundries, worked on the railroads, worked in not only the tanneries, but the other factories, International Harvester. My dad worked at Allis-Chalmers for 40 years. A lot of them came over, they would work, and they would send money to Mexico.
Polish and Mexican immigrants usually left their homelands to escape political and economic oppression. Both groups tended to lean left politically during their early years in the neighborhood.
People weren't ashamed to be called a socialist, you know. It was something to be proud of in them days, you know. Real progressive party. Did a lot for Milwaukee.
Poles and Latinos had more in common than either group might have realized, and both groups faced the same principal challenges: how to build and sustain strong communities.
It's me again, Mary. You might notice that we always show you some of the contributions that the cultural groups have made to southeastern Wisconsin and to the United States. We will do the same with the Polish Americans. Let's begin with food. When you go to a Milwaukee Brewers game, you will see the race of the sausages. The race is between a number of sausages, including the Italian sausage, the bratwurst, and another sausage. I'll bet you know one of these. It's the Polish sausage, or kielbasa. There is a wonderful dish that many of you may not have eaten. It's the Polish dumpling, filled with potatoes or other goodies. They are called pierogies. Let's look at Polish-American contributions in music. There is one dance that is very Polish, but also danced often by Germans. It's the polka. Now, do you remember how I mentioned the very famous Polish musician Frédéric Chopin? Well, he was the most famous piano player of his time. In the 1950s and 1960s, there was a Polish-American piano player that was also the most famous piano player of his time in the United States, and he came from Milwaukee. His name was Liberace. In entertainment, there are a number of famous Poles. You probably all know the diva of homemaking arts, Martha Stewart, and the host of the TV show Wheel of Fortune, Pat Sajak. Some of you may have heard of a baseball Hall of Famer who played his entire career for the St. Louis Cardinals. The teachers might know him. He is Stan the Man Musial. Some Polish Americans made it big in other sports. The Americans have always been very good at taking home medals in women's figure skating. In recent years, there's been Nancy Kerrigan, Sarah Hughes, Michelle Kwong, Sasha Cohen, and others. A few years ago, a Polish-American teenager won a gold medal in the event. Her name was Tara Lipinski. But in southeastern Wisconsin, the greatest contributions of the Polish Americans has been the stability they have added to neighborhoods. They contributed hundreds of mom-and-pop businesses and a few larger enterprises. They have always had a very strong work ethic and would take any jobs that were available, as well as contribute jobs through their businesses. And wherever you found Polish neighborhoods, you would find sparkling cottages and homes and some of the best maintained yards anywhere. Why, I hear there are still Polish neighborhoods where the families wash down their sidewalks and alleys every day. This was the way of my grandmother.